Something has been kept out of the history books about the Black Death. Not because scholars missed it, but because the people living through it left almost nothing behind. No diaries, no letters, no private confessions scratched into parchment by someone watching their street empty out. Just silence, stretching across one of the world's worst catastrophes in human history. And the silence turns out to be more revealing than people realize, because the records that did survive, the ones buried in legal archives and city lawbooks, and the memoirs of men who watched armies fall, contain details so strange and specific that they completely rewrite the version of events most of us were handed. Biological weapons, an army that invaded a plague and accidentally brought it home, a word every person on Earth used again not long ago, born directly from this disaster. These are documented. They're in the primary sources. Almost nobody talks about them. Here's what the record actually shows. There are diaries from the Black Death that historians will never read. Not because they were lost to fire or flood, but because they were never written at all. When the plague tore through Europe between 1346 and 1353, killing somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, the ordinary person left almost no written record of what it felt like to live through it. No letters home, no private thoughts, almost total silence. And that silence is the story. This video is about what we actually know from the primary sources that do survive. The wills, the chronicles, the court documents, the legal records, and the details inside them that most people have never heard. Not the textbook version with swollen lymph nodes and the general death toll. The real version. The one with biological weapons, ironic armies, and a word you use every single day that was born directly from this catastrophe. I've been going into a deep dive on the historical record, and there are details here that will completely change how you picture the plague. We're going to cover the stories that almost nobody tells, starting with one that most people assume they already know, and ending with one that almost nobody realizes changes the entire picture of what the plague actually did for the world. The last one is worth staying for. So let's start with the part that feels the most impossible. The Black Death killed 30 to 50% of the entire population of Europe. Think about that number for a second. Not a village, not a region, the entire continent. The pandemic moved fast. It often killed a host within days of their first developing the high fever, the telltale rash, and the repellent buboes or swelling in the armpits and groin, which turned black and burst. This was not a slow disease. It was a fire, and when it was over, the people left behind had almost nothing to tell us what it was like from the inside. Here's why. Almost no personal letters and literally no diaries survive from ordinary families during the plague years. What historians rely on instead are the wills that dying parents wrote to provide for their children and their souls. The archives of Bologna alone hold the largest known collection of these plague-era testaments. And here's the part that genuinely unsettles people when they hear it. Many of the wills are so formulaic, so routine in their legal language, that they never even mention the epidemic happening around the person writing them. People were dying in one of the worst catastrophes in human history, and their final legal documents read like nothing unusual was happening at all. No panic, no grief, just property transfers and prayers. That's the silence. That's what we're working with. But some of the voices did survive, and one of them tells us something that sounds more like a war crime than a natural disaster. A principal source on the origin of the Black Death is a memoir written by Italian Gabriele de Mussi. And what de Mussi describes is this. The Mongol army hurled plague-infected cadavers into the besieged Crimean city of Kaffa, thereby transmitting the disease to the inhabitants, and fleeing survivors of the siege spread plague from Kaffa to the Mediterranean basin. They used trebuchets, siege weapons, to launch the bodies of their own dead soldiers over the city walls and into the population inside. If this account is correct, Kaffa should be recognized as the site of the most spectacular incident of biological warfare ever, with the Black Death as its disastrous consequence. Historians debate exactly how much of the plague spread was caused by this specific event. But the account itself is documented, and the tactic is considered plausible given the technology and thinking of the time. So the disease that would go on to kill a third of Europe may have started as a weapon, and the people who launched it had no idea what they were actually unleashing. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the epidemic westward to Mediterranean ports, where it spread inland, affecting Sicily in 1347, then North Africa, mainland Italy, Spain, and France in 1348, and then Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries in 1349. It moved like trade, because it traveled with trade. Every ship that left a plague port carried the disease to the next one. Now, while all of this was happening, there was a group of people who thought the plague was a gift. On hearing of the pestilence ravaging England, the Scots decided to take advantage, amassing an army in Selkirk Forest on the Scottish borders in autumn 1349. Their thinking was straightforward. God is punishing the English. This is our moment. Let's invade. The Scots, upon hearing of the plague amongst the English, and believing that the wrath of God had befallen their old enemy, amassed their armies in Selkirk and set off to face their adversary. However, they soon discovered that the plague was no respecter of nationality. Amassing their army in the forest of Selkirk, the Scots' close quarters proved the ideal incubation ground for the plague, killing 5,000 troops. As they fled back north, they carried the infection with them, devastating Edinburgh and the Scottish lowlands. The invasion they launched to exploit the plague ended up delivering the plague directly to their own country. That story is the historical record. It's documented, and almost no Black Death content ever touches it. Here's something else that no one talks about. The doctors treating plague victims were not using anything resembling medicine. They were using astrology. Medieval physicians used a diagram called the Zodiac man, a chart that mapped the 12 astrological signs into different parts of the human body. Before performing bloodletting or an incision, a doctor would check a patient's star sign to make sure the procedure didn't conflict with the corresponding body part. Bleeding someone near a body part ruled by their current sign was considered dangerous. The plague was killing people by the millions, and the medical response was to check the stars first. This is not fringe history. This is what the primary sources show. And none of it worked, because nobody had any concept of germ theory. They didn't know what was causing it, so they couldn't stop it. Which brings us to the one response that actually did help, and gave us a word that every person on Earth used again not that long ago. The first use of quarantine was in 1377, when yet another wave of plague hit Europe. In response, the city of Dubrovnik, called Ragusa in the medieval period, instituted one of the first official plague quarantines. Anyone arriving from a plague-stricken place would be stopped at the gate and made to sit 40 days in isolation, either on the nearby uninhabited island of Mirkan or in the town of Kavat, before stepping inside. The order was copied into the city's lawbook, the Liber Verdis, or Green Book, which still survives in Dubrick's archives. And the word itself, it still survives too. Quarantine, from quaranta, Italian for 40. The number 40 wasn't random. Health officials may have prescribed a 40-day quarantine because the number had a great symbolic and religious significance to medieval Christians. When God flooded the earth, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and Jesus fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. A biblical number because of public health policy, and that policy became the foundation of how every government on earth responds to infectious disease today. The ruling was remarkable in its foresight. To detain people who looked perfectly healthy, Ragusa's counselors had to grasp that a disease might incubate unseen, an intuition that arrived roughly 5 centuries before germ theory could explain it. Now, remember that mega loop I planted at the start? The idea that the plague story is mostly silence, and what did survive changes how you see the whole thing? Here's what it closes. While people were dying, a movement was traveling through Europe that may have been making the spread worse. Groups of religious flagellants, believers who whipped themselves and each other publicly as acts of penance, marched from town to town. The open wounds they created on their own bodies likely made them more susceptible to infection, and their constant movement meant they were carrying the disease to every new location they entered as a form of spiritual outreach. The Pope eventually banned the practice, but by then, the Flagellants had already done their damage. And here's the thing that most people genuinely don't know about what came after all this. When the plague finally slowed, it had killed so many people that the entire labor system of medieval Europe collapsed. There weren't enough workers, and when laborers became scarce, workers gained power. Wages rose, serfs began to negotiate. The rigid feudal system that had kept people locked to land they didn't own started to crack. In that shifting landscape, women gained property rights that had never been available to them before. Land, money, and legal standing that the old system had denied them. A catastrophe that killed half of Europe accidentally created conditions for more social mobility than anything that had come before it. The plague didn't just kill people. It broke the world that existed and forced a new one to be built from what was left. The silence in the archives isn't just about absence. It's the shape of something enormous, and the details that did survive tell a story that's stranger, darker, and more human than any textbook version of it. If this kind of deep dive into history is something that you want more of, subscribe and drop a comment below. I read every single one, and the best suggestions actually turn into videos. There's another video on this channel that goes just as deep into a story most people think they know, but absolutely do not. It's right there when you're ready.